First and foremost, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm not sure where you're calling in from and joining us, but if you're in the Northeast, it's sort of a cold and dreary and gray day. Perfect for sitting around and talking about fundraising. So thanks so much for joining us. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the necessities of attracting for your organization to attract what we would call sort of mega gifts. We'll get into a little bit of what that means. It kind of means it's something a little bit different for every organization. But we thought the best place to start was talking with a couple of fundraisers that operate sort of with the donors that truly define that term, and are giving sort of some of the most influential and largest gifts. And I think we all can learn, no matter the size of our organization, from them. And they also happen to be two people that I've just really had the great pleasure of knowing and working with through the years. So I will introduce them to you now. First is Mindee Barham. Mindee is the Vice President of Development at Grameen America. I think we literally first met in the buffet line at an event for AFP New York City. We both eventually ended up on the board there working together, then eventually had the great pleasure of working with Mindee at Grameen America as they designed and launched the campaign they're in now. And we'll hear a little bit about that as we go. Chuck Harris, unbeknownst to Chuck, first was on my radar as a fundraiser. He was an executive at Goldman and known to be charitable. Never had the opportunity to meet him because I was a lousy fundraiser and unable to make that connection. But then eventually, Chuck's sort of path took him in a different direction, which we'll hear a little bit about. But he was on the board of an organization called College Summit, now called Peer Forward. We got to work together very closely there. And then ultimately, which is ironic since I think neither of us are huge proponents of event fundraising these days, he was co-chairing a gala that I was working on. And then we worked very closely together through all of that. So I think you'll enjoy hearing a lot from Chuck. He's currently the Chief Development Officer at Blue Meridian Partners, sort of one of the more interesting and exciting organizations out there today, which we'll hear all about. Before we jump into it, just a little housekeeping. If you have questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom. You can click that, put in a question. There's also the chat function. If you have some tech issues, kind of put it over there and we'll try and help you out. It's probably the volume on your computer, but we can try and figure that out for you. But so just put that in the chat. Also, it'd be great. I know we have lots of people from all over. If you want to sort of put your name and where you're from in the chat for everyone to see, I'm sure that would be fun. Overall premise of what we're going to kind of talk a little bit about today. The pandemic has really sort of accelerated lots of trends, right? Sort of should we work remote? Now that's sort of, gone by the wayside as a debate. Now it's more how much. E-commerce, wealth gaps, unfortunately, every sort of trend that was out there has really been accelerated over these past 7 or 8 months that we've been into this. And that's happened in philanthropy as well. I would tell you for years now, I've started to see philanthropists focus their giving and give larger gifts to fewer organizations. That's really kind of shot up in the last few months, and particularly on the highest end. One thing I would say is there's some common attributes to organizations that are attracting these sort of really large gifts. Typically you're seeing there's a big idea involved, there's a dynamic sales force, and probably the hardest part is there's a connectivity to people that have the ability to give these gifts, right? That's sort of the missing link for most of us. Early in my career was the big, ask Oprah for money. Well, great, do you know Oprah, right? So that sort of piece of it is still very prevalent. So we'll explore with Mindee and Chuck, how they've gone about, sort of attracting gifts, these sort of 8-figure gifts. But again, I think we can learn no matter what the larger gifts you are trying to raise are. So we're going to jump in. Mindee, let's start with you. For some people tuning in, much to their detriment, they might not be familiar with Grameen America. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the organization, and then maybe sort of help us understand, what's proved so appealing about your case for support, sort of your big idea that's really attracted philanthropists. Mindee?
Great. Thanks, Craig, and thanks for having me today. So Grameen America, for those who don't know us, we are a domestic national microfinance organization. We provide small loans to women who live in poverty to help them start or expand small businesses. We launched here in the United States in 2008. We were brought here by the Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus, and it started as proof of concept in New York to see if this model could work in the United States. It had been part of the developing world. And here we are 12 years later, and we have scaled to over 15 cities across the United States. We've served over 130,000 women, and we have distributed over $1.6 billion in very small microloans, averaging about $3,000. And so we have gone beyond proof of concept and have scaled, and our goal is to continue to scale and really double our size and our impact across the country. Thinking about what has been attractive to funders or mega donors about our organization, I think of a couple of things. One is, this big idea. We are looking to be a poverty alleviation organization and make an impact on women who, are disenfranchised from the mainstream financial system, and help bring financial inclusion to those who need it and to bring them access to capital. I think the second thing I would point to is our ability to scale. So, it started small and in one location has shown that it can be successful, not just in New York City, but as we've taken this from location to location, it has proven that it has the ability to take that model and replicate itself. Something that's very attractive to many of our donors is our sustainable business model, which is a unique kind of nonprofit. We do charge interest on our loans, and we reinvest that interest into the portfolio. So any dollar that's invested into our portfolio has a multiplier effect, and it keeps getting on lent. And so, it can, $1 that's invested can in 5 years become $12. And we take the interest that we earn from this portfolio, and we are able to, over a period of years at each of our locations, cover our expenses. So I think that's very attractive, this idea of a sustainable business model and this multiplier effect and this ability to scale, which you'll hear a number of times over this discussion today.
That's great. And I do think it's, there's a lot of things in there, right? If you, most people that have a lot of money made it in some fashion or think they made it in some fashion or are connected to business, and they like to sort of hear things like, oh, there's multipliers effects. This is sustainable. That, there's a lot in there that I think is really compelling. Mindee, you spent a lot of your career in, what I would consider more traditional organizations, United Way, YMCA. How do organizations like that, present their case in a way that, sort of has that big idea that donors could find appealing the way Grameen has been able to do?
Yes, I think it's finding what your big idea is that your organization is addressing, and finding ways to both measure that impact you're having on whoever it is you're serving and what your niche is, and then being able to tell that story and communicate it. So I think having impact measurement and being able to understand your impact on your clients, and then being able to scale that for whatever that means for your cohort or your subset.
And in many ways, a lot of sort of traditional organizations, like they're already operating at the scale that so many people want to get to. So it's, how do you just sort of think about maybe the work or describe it a little bit different? Chuck, why don't you tell us a little bit about Blue Meridian Partners? I mean, how it's structured, what you're trying to do. I know it's been sort of an idea that you've been chasing in many ways and in many parts of your career, almost since you got into philanthropy, but it's really evolving and sort of taking off. It'll seem like overnight, but you'll know that it's like a 20-year overnight success story. But let's start there. What is Blue Meridian Partners?
Thanks, Craig, and thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to do something may seem bizarre, which is read my answer to this, but for the simple reason that we've been working for years to get how we talk about our work down, and we've sort of got it. I haven't memorized it yet, but I want to say it. So here we go. Blue Meridian Partners is a pioneering philanthropic model for finding and funding scalable solutions to the problems that trap young people and families in poverty in the United States. These complex problems require integrated solutions, so we partner with social sector leaders to target drivers of poverty from a range of angles and connect nationwide and regional work to get that done. Importantly, we operate with an investor mindset, but we measure success in terms of social impact rather than financial return. In practice, this means we view our grants as investments that supply flexible capital for organizations. We believe in providing sustained support for operational evolution and strategic guidance to maximize long-term impact. I want to mention also, importantly, that we have no endowment. We have quite a lot of capital at this point, but it's all performance-based capital to be on-granted as rapidly as we can do so with integrity and good results. And that was an explicit decision coming out of an endowed family foundation, the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, to convert the bulk of what was left of their endowment into performance-based grants into Blue Meridian. So we only get the money if we're performing as an entity. And then in turn, we make long-term performance-based grants to the actors on the ground, who also only get the money if they perform. That's not black and white or binary, but you get the idea. We sit here knowing that if we can't replenish our coffers every several years, I guess we weren't good enough. And we like that, having that market pressure on our work. And I think it has actually an attractive factor to some of our investors.
So, I mean, so that's obviously, what that factor, sort of the urgency, moving money out the door, we're going to hold ourselves accountable. Like, those are all factors that are attractive to your investors, what we might call donors. But like, what are other things that you found attractive about the model? Because really the model has been, with Edna McConnell Clark's money as sort of a corpus, then there's been a lot of other money that's sort of come around it from individual philanthropists, other foundations, maybe to a slightly lesser degree. But what do you think is the thing that's attracted those partners?
Yeah, I could answer this in a lot of different ways, but let me try it for today. I will say that, first of all, it was about 10 years of experimentation at the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation and at a much smaller entity that I founded called Sea Change Capital, to figure out what it would take to get wealthy families and institutional funders to come together to gang up on problems. I think we could all acknowledge, and could have acknowledged 30 years ago, that the problems are bigger than any philanthropist, but it still remains unusual behavior in the sector for people to come together, park a little bit of their ego at the door in pursuit of some larger impact. And I think some of the things that have allowed this to happen for us, over the 2006 to 2013 timeframe, Edna McConnell Clark experimented with different models of aggregating capital than the one that is Blue Meridian. But in that process, we worked with 55 different other philanthropists around the country, and in grants that we put $150 million into over that period. They, as a group, put $450 million into. So we came out of that with some really great relationships and a lot of trust in the world. And without that, this would not have happened. It was also the Clark family, two of Edna's grandsons, who have been very involved with the foundation, made a very explicit decision to switch over from being a perpetuity and making $40 to $50 million of grants a year in combination with other people, so the impact was bigger, but to actually accelerating the payout of what they had left, both to see more results on the ground sooner, but also to attract other investors into the model. And so I'm going to say that one of the really key success factors at the launch of Blue Meridian Partners was a $200 million opening gift from the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, which we then went out to the people we knew best and trusted the most and had worked with previously to say, if you would put at least $50 million in alongside our 200 for starters, we will make you a, quote, general partner in this fund, and you will help us co-create the thing to start with, and you will have the same voting power over every investment decision that we have for the life of the fund. So relationships, experience, some sense of success in that experience, major lead gift, and then an outsourced solution with significant decision rights. And I couldn't emphasize that enough. While maybe over time, this world will get to a place where people do in this market what they do in private equity or hedge funds, which is give you the money and then stand back and wait for it to come back in multiples. Here, of course, there's no money coming back. So you have to provide an experience and a feedback loop, which is very much individually designed by each philanthropist. Nonetheless, I think those were the things that brought it together. And effectively, we went from an average $5 to $6 million incoming co-investment amount from our co-investors to now having individual funders in Blue Meridian with as much as $500 or $600 million in the kitty. So it's built on itself. And I'd also say that we are in a moment right now that none of us has ever seen, where you've got chaos politically and health-wise in the world around us, and yet the wealthy have gotten much wealthier. So a combination of urgency and resources and the constant drone of criticism, and probably appropriately so in the background, about what the gulf between what people have pledged to do and what they're actually doing. I used to find that with wealthy families, the story was something like this. Chuck, we make larger gifts to the organizations that my wife or I are personally involved in. Interestingly, though, our financial capacity has outgrown our capacity for personal involvement. And so it used to be people kind of stopped then, or they maybe gave 100 or 200 million to their alma mater. Increasingly, there are true social sector entrepreneurial solutions on the ground that can absorb that kind of money. And an increasing number of people are saying, well, why don't I supplement the stuff I'm doing directly with another approach? And every one of our partners has got significant philanthropic activity away from Blue Meridian. That also creates a virtuous cycle, because we learn about that. They learn about it with each other, and all kinds of things spring up in the world that probably wouldn't have if we weren't working together.
And it's a real powerful moment of like need, and then like wealth, and like this real, I think, a sophistication in the way people are giving is sort of like evolving, where they're just thinking about it differently, or they've realized, just keep doing what they're doing. It's almost chasing bad money after bad. But then at the same time, what I've really seen over the last 8 months, which has been kind of inspiring to me, is in every other moment of uncertainty, at least in my lifetime, that the sector has sort of backed off, right? The nonprofit sector has said, let me cut, let me conserve, let me hold tight. And I think you're seeing a lot of organizations, particularly the successful organizations, they're pushing forward and saying, well, now you need me more than ever. Now my ideas are bigger than ever. Now I need more money, because now you see how badly things are, and I can fix this. And it's an exciting sort of way everything has come together. But at the middle of it, you do need someone that could go out there and sort of tell the story, get people excited. So, Mindee, very uniquely, in your organization, former, Fortune 100 CEO, Andrea Young, as the CEO. So she brings sort of a network and a sophistication. But I think more, even scrape away who she was before she had this job, she's still essentially a very dynamic person that gets out there and tells the story in a way that works. So talk a little about that. Like, what role is, the she play as the CEO versus the board versus the development staff, and sort of going out there to these largest prospects?
Yeah, having Andrea at the helm is definitely an incredible asset for Grameen America. She brings just incredible leadership capacity, but also connections, and brings credibility to the organization, and sort of brings recognition that we might not otherwise have gotten, at least up until now. But it's really a partnership. She is able to make a lot of connections for us, her relationships with other CEOs and with others, with board members. And so she, brings in those connections. She's in high demand in speaking engagements at different conferences. And so, it brings recognition to Grameen America's name that we might not otherwise have. But then she really partners with the board and the development team to leverage all of that. So she really, I feel like the two of us have a very strong partnership, where she might go in and be able to tell the big story and sell the concept of what we're doing and really weave the tale. But then she, partners with me or with the team to come in on with that, so that we can provide the detail and then do the follow on. So we're then taking on the relationship with that funder, or with, what comes next in the strategy. I would say in terms of these transformational gifts and some of the mega gifts that we're talking about today, she is a very hands-on leader. Obviously, the larger donors really want to speak to her. They want to meet her. And we see these as very multi-layered relationships, where there's the donor or the head of the foundation that wants to speak directly to her, but there's the staff or the family office that needs to then relate to the staff of our organization. So we've developed a very good rhythm, a good partnership, and I think the communication between the two of us is important, and with the board and with her and the team, it's important that we work together.
Yeah, and again, you have to have, wherever you've gotten it, you have to sort of be able to sit into the conversations with a great deal of credibility, whether that's your prior career, what you've done. Like, I think if people are looking to get bigger money, they are paying very close attention to who's selling them, because those are the leaders of the organization. So Chuck, I know in a lot of ways, like it's been a long journey, but then there's also been this sort of scaling of really big gifts in a unique way that, you don't really see in most places. I know there's not, at any sort of major gift program, there's not sort of two donor or investor journeys that are alike. But I think it'd be informative to sort of walk through maybe like, how did you sort of sell the first couple of prospects? There was some relationship with Ed McConnell Clark, but how did you get them to this new thing? And then how does that evolve? Like now when you're talking to prospects that are more likely removed from that original cohort that already had co-invested with Ed McConnell Clark, what's that story? How are you sort of selling those prospects?
So the people who joined us initially, as I mentioned, were people we knew quite well and had worked well together previously. But we had together learned something pretty important, which was that, sort of no matter how high quality the program or initiative is, or even within reason how much money you can put up against the program, that this kind of change we're driving for does not happen in 5 years or even 10 years. And we had been in a pattern of meeting a new organization that was interesting to us. After due diligence, if we still have conviction, we go into planning. Very strong support from the Bridgespan Group. I want to acknowledge the impact they've had on our work and continue to. And off that business plan, we would devise a 5-year grant from the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation, paid over time based on performance. And then we would go out and ask other people to join us on those same terms. In our best situations in that mode, at the end of 5 years, the grantee would have grown significantly, gotten better at what they do, and not even begun to scratch the surface against what we thought the ultimate aim was, which was to take their approach to solving a particular problem, which in our judgment is the best we could find in the world, and make that the new normal way that particular kind of work gets done in this country, which is now our goal. So as we thought about, as the Clarks kind of empowered us to think about something bigger and new and more collaborative, we had a couple of ideas. Number one, we need to be there for a much longer period of time than even 5 or 10 years. If the grantee performs, it might be a 20-year engagement, and we need to have the kind of committed capital that could actually stay the course of something like that. Now we do invest in phases because forecasting beyond 5 or 6 or 8 years is kind of a fool's errand. It'll always turn out different from that. But nonetheless, we're there on that train, working weekly with the leadership to get that done. The people we went out to agreed with that. We also learned that in the process of scaling individual multi-site organizations to be present in more places around the United States, that we had no capacity for helping them put real roots down in a new community. Even in New York, which is our home, that's not what we're set up to do. So we learned in the late stages of the pre-Blue Meridian world to partner with significant regional or local funders. In our case, we began with George Kaiser in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Duke Endowment in the Carolinas, who could, in fact, when they co-invested in an organization with us, create all the momentum that it took to have these organizations become coherent members of an ecosystem in a community, to connect with the political infrastructure, to connect with the philanthropic infrastructure and the business infrastructure. So I think having gone through this sort of period of trying shorter term, nonetheless unusually long engagements, people were attracted to see if this would work. And I would say that I think we're about to be in our 7th year of operation. And I think we can declare at least interim victory on the fundraising front, but whether this work actually creates the change at a nationwide scale and in specific communities that we aspire to, the jury is still out. All we can really do is try to identify leading indicators and track them like a mother, but it's stay tuned. I guess I want to say that also we had a provision in our first partnership agreement that provided that anyone who had joined us, who after 3 years of operation was dissatisfied with the whole thing, either individually or collectively, could pull out. Now, they couldn't pull out money of theirs that we had already committed to someone, but otherwise they could be done. Well, that moment came and went in the fall of 2018. Nobody quit. And subsequently, almost everybody has re-upped in larger dollar amounts for another round. So it was, it was even more of an experiment, which could have collapsed at that point. And I think if we hadn't offered the decision rights, the deep engagement, and the variety of approaches to stewardship, which we can talk about if you want, we wouldn't have built the momentum that we seem to have now. And as we just said a minute ago, we've sort of found ourselves in a very unusual moment in the world that our model speaks to.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think I want to get into the stewardship a little bit, and maybe I'll touch on that soon. But I also just think, if for nothing else, to just sort of aggravate all the fundraisers in the room, interim success in fundraising. How much money have you guys raised so far?
$2.8 billion.
Yeah, and that's a mix of individuals, though they might have family foundations, but sort of single person decision makers and sort of more traditional foundations with staffs and stuff like that. It's a
We
real
have
mix.
both. We have 18 investors at this point, including Edna McConnell Clark, and probably 10 or 12 of them are living and investing, pulling money out of DAFs and out of family foundations, et cetera, to put with us. But there are several much larger institutional funders, including the Gates Foundation. Of course, they're living, but nonetheless, their resources are quite unusual. And I think for the foundations, the big endowed foundations that have joined us, in many cases, it's a desire to see how this works and to experiment with different approaches. And some of those folks have program areas around improving the effectiveness of the field of philanthropy. I'll just cite the Hewlett Foundation, which has partnered with us since the very first thing we did in the capital aggregation world, because they wanted to see this kind of collaborative work develop.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So Mindee, also, unique mission, sort of unique approach. I'd also say unique for what a, less than 20-year-old organization. You're in sort of a $300 million campaign. $100 million of that is philanthropy. It's ahead of the apparently now too slow projections that we had initially done with you. But, you have a more traditional sort of structured staff, traditional sort of fundraising approach. How is your team put together? What does that look like? And how do you sort of identify the talent that you want on your team?
Yeah, so we're actually a very small team for the amount of philanthropy that we're raising. We're 7 people, and we break down across revenue lines of corporate, institutional, which is private foundations and government, and individual major gifts. We are all based in New York, even though we're a national organization. And so we, besides paying attention to our revenue streams, we have to think about our geographies and how we're going to manage our work in all of the 15 cities that we're in. And so we think of it as sort of a matrix of revenue stream and geography, and people are assigned different cities to pay attention to make sure we're raising the amount we need for each of those locations. It's a great team. When I'm putting together, I've done a lot of development hiring over these years. I've been in development for about 20 years. I really look for people who are mission driven, who really believe in the work that they're going to be raising. It's not just, selling widgets, you're selling a mission, and who really believe in the work and want to get deeply involved, who have experience. I've learned that you really need to understand all the pieces of this and what it takes. People who are good communicators and people who can really work together. And so building a team that, can work well with each other across our organization and then with our funders. And it's important that they gel as a team. And we have, as I said, a fantastic team right now. And they've been very successful over this past couple of years of this campaign.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to get into your backgrounds a little bit because I think it's interesting, I think informative of sort of how you both sort of approach this. But before I do, I want to pull one of the questions off of the Q&A because I have a seemingly unpopular view on this, but I want to see if you guys have a view. Donor advice fund, DAFs, do you have a specific strategy that you use to go try and get people to give money out of DAFs? Chuck, in many ways, you're almost like a DAF on steroids to some degree, but like what any thoughts on donor advice funds and how do you unlock that money? There's a lot of talk about how much money is sitting there.
Well, at least in our case, we have never produced a significant investment by working directly with the sponsors of these donor advised funds. Not to say we haven't tried and aren't still trying, but most of our partners have a relationship with someone else who's already in our deal, right? And it just turns out that the ultra wealthy use DAFs. But we don't go to the DAF. We've gone to the people whose money is there, and it's not the only thing they're doing, but it's one of the tools that they often use. So, while I think the world has got it wrong that DAFs are just locking money up, because as I've understand it, for years the payout rate has been much higher than traditional foundation payout, but it is not transparent and not reported, et cetera, et cetera. But it's a major place where a lot of money is sitting right now, and to the degree that we can make actionable opportunities available to that people who steer that money, I think we'll probably see more of that over time and not less.
Mindee, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would just add that in each of the cities where we operate, we have relationships with the community foundations. And because a lot of the community foundations are managing portfolios of donor advised funds, that is one way that we try to get in front of, it's essentially major gift fundraising, but to at least be able to be known to those community foundations and the development officers who are running those pots of money and communicating with their donors, so that in each of our cities, we try to have local relationships through those foundations.
Yeah, and I think you both hit on where my head is on it. And there's a lot of people out there talking around like, how do you market to donor advised fund holders? And I've seen direct mail companies even like upselling, like, oh, we're going to get you those names. To me, it's no different than if I said I'm going to sort of like go after people that have Amex, platinum cards, right? Like it's a way in which you're going to pay your gift. Like I need to have a relationship with that donor, and they may send me a check, they may transfer stock, they may use their DAF. And that's sort of the way that I think about it. And it sounds like you all are similar on that. So I just wanted to get that question out there. Chuck, let's go to you for a second. You lots of people to varying degrees of success have sort of come from the for-profit world into the nonprofit world. I would say you've been sort of an outlier in my mind in terms of like a lot of success, but then I realized that Steve Orr, my boss, is on the line. And obviously he's been the most successful person that has come into the nonprofit world. But Chuck, like talk about your journey. How did you end up doing what you're doing?
Sure, thanks. Well, I suppose I got into investment banking out of expediency more than anything else. I had pursued a musical career in my 20s that was economic failure, notwithstanding being a lot of fun. And this was one of the things I thought I could get into and maybe be able to support a family in the foreseeable future. But a time came in the early 2000s when I'd sort of had enough of that, thought I had enough money to go do whatever I wanted to do. Decided to become an engaged philanthropist personally. The first person I met with that frame of mind was J.B. Schramm, the founder and former CEO of College Summit. Did my own due diligence, joined his board, made a gift which was big for me. Almost before the ink was dry on the check, I began to realize the following. In the for-profit commercial capital markets there are really dedicated funders at every stage of organizational development, and lots of money that has been pooled in each of those places. Not to say it's easy for an upcoming startup, but they are able to raise their money by and large in periodic rounds of funding, not by having their CEO spend 60 to 70% of every week out knocking on doors and trying to build new relationships. And I just said to myself, because I found the social entrepreneurs I was meeting, frankly, more interesting and exciting than the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies I've been working with. And I don't mean that to knock anybody, I just did. And I thought to myself, why couldn't the best of these people raise their growth capital in advance of their growth? And so everything I've done since then has been to try to figure out how to do that. While I was at College Summit with the late Art Sandberg, I led a small growth capital raise that changed their opportunity set and their focus. I helped Wendy Kopp a little bit with one of her growth capital raises. And I came out of that just thinking there's something to do here and maybe we can move the market a little bit over time. it really wasn't until I joined Nancy Rube at the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation where all the pieces of what you need to do that came together. And even then it wasn't obvious that we would get to where we, not even close to where we are now, but we've been chipping away at it. And I do think that the, people will read our partnership agreement and say, well, like, there's not a binding, this is wrong, by the way, but they will read it and say, there's not a binding commitment anywhere in here. Why do you bother? And the reason we bother is it creates a sense among the group that we're all committed to something together. And it would make it much harder for somebody to give up on it than if we just had a little short letter of intent or something like that. So, we're trying to create a durable institution that's performance-based. And fortunately for the confluence of various things that have come together, it's happening. A big part of our goal is to see other people do the same. We're only dealing with economic mobility in the United States of America. There's lots of other stuff that needs to be funded. I'm pleased to say that the Gates Foundation, in particular their philanthropic partnership group that runs the Giving Pledge, has begun to work with us and some of our peers in this space to make us better known, to help us reach new people. Feels like it's starting to get finally starting to get a little bit of traction. And I would cite two other groups that are similar but also quite different from us. One would be Co-Impact, which is being incubated at the Rockefeller Foundation, which, if you look at the structure, is very much like Blue Meridian, but their work is all in the developing world. And then I would cite the Audacious Project, which has also been quite successful at mobilizing significant capital on a very lighter touch, shorter term, star-studded way, but Lord knows it's working. And we seek to partner with them wherever we possibly can, because you can come at this in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, and I do want to just shout out, because I know there's a couple people here that know and have worked with JB, including Michelle Taffel, who's got a question here, but like he would agree that he's more interesting than most Fortune 500 CEOs that you were meeting with. But anyway, Mindee, why don't you talk about your path a little bit, because it's much more, at least in my, it's much more similar to my path, and I think a lot of fundraisers' path. Sort of what has your career been like, and sort of what's the biggest difference today in fundraising from when you started, 20 years ago?
Yes, so I started on the program side of nonprofit. I've always been in the nonprofit sector, and then switched after a couple of years to the fundraising side. And I sort of was able to jump in the middle, didn't have to start at the beginning of the fundraising scale. So that was lucky. I went to work for an organization that was about to launch a capital campaign. So in many ways, my work then was very similar to my work now. A campaign looked similar in that you worked with your board and you had to identify what was your case and how were you going to communicate that need and how you were going to, sort of build the campaign structure. And I had some, I was completely new to fundraising, but I had some very good leaders and mentors in the field that helped me learn and sort of take off from there. One interesting difference was that a lot of things, there was no, technology was very different. So, we would go physically down to the foundation center or down to the Hall of Records to look people up and understand what people's capacity was. So obviously that has come a long way. But just, I would say, now all of those pieces have built, I went from that campaign to working at some large, some small organizations. I'd say Grameen on its face is sort of a mid-sized organization, but certainly in its growth is growing rapidly and attracting major scale investment, which is making us rapidly become a larger organization and attract larger capital.
Well, I would say, like, if you had told me when I was excited by the technological innovation that the Foundation Center had gone to CD-ROMs that I could keep in my office, that someday I would be video talking to people, that was like the Jetsons to me at that point. But anyway, there's been a lot of change. Let's come a little bit back towards fundraising. Mindee, how do you sort of identify and then, and gain access to the prospects that are becoming, your largest donors, right? What does that look like?
I would say originally it was very traditional. We have our board, our CEO, who are able to bring their connections and who we're able to work with to identify funders, investors who would be interested in working with us, people who are interested in our mission. Unlike a college or university, we have to find investors who would be interested in our mission and want to invest in that sector. But I would say as we've grown and as we've scaled and been able to show our impact, that we've become better known by people who wanted to make these large scale investments. And so we've been in a position where, you talked about Audacious Project, while we've been involved in some different processes like that with these contests, which I think is like a new trend in philanthropy of funders coming together to make an impact. And while we haven't, maybe won some of those competitions, it has put us in front of a number of people who otherwise might not have known of us. And so this has given us opportunity, and we have found some people coming to us to learn more about us and to get to know us better. And that's given us an opportunity. And then I would say just the moment we're in of the pandemic and the real focus on the economic inequality of our time and the pandemic making that inequality even more disparate, and philanthropists looking to make an impact on that with their philanthropy has driven people to want to talk to us about how they can use their philanthropy to make be part of that just recovery and part of that economic change in our country.
Yeah, so sort of work like crazy for 15 years and then hope the world pays attention to your issue. Okay, got it. Chuck, you mentioned stewardship earlier, right? So I think, how you're stewarding gifts that people that are making, $50 million gifts is very different than how you're going to steward, my $100 gift. But talk a little bit about that. How are you stewarding your investors to kind of keep them engaged and frankly ready to make that next gift? You said a lot of them have re-upped despite the size of those initial gifts.
Well, our structure itself requires pretty significant engagement. And so people, if they weren't willing to engage with us on a much more regular basis than donors usually do to the things that they fund, it wouldn't be working at all and they wouldn't be involved in this way. But we have touch points that are just there, tailor-made. When we have an idea that's still a gleam in our eye, but one that we like a lot, we start talking to our partners about that very early, even before we've contacted the organization to say, could we talk? By the time we get around to making a $50 million first phase commitment to an organization, we've been talking about this through the due diligence, through the planning process, and it's 1.5 to 2 years before we're asking the partners to make that very significant commitment. And I think the evidence would suggest it dies sooner, somewhere along the way. But just the ability to be together as a group, it used to be 4 times a year. This year with the pandemic and some emergency relief that we came up with, and the need to pivot our work to reflect the world we're now in, we've met a lot more often. But even, let's go back to the quarterly thing. It's a very significant and substantial exchange of information. We have historically a very small fundraising team, Nancy and myself, but we are so deeply supported by our team that sources the deals, does the diligence, our communications team who prepare materials, that it's really kind of funny to say it's a small fundraising team because that's our lifeblood. So everybody contributes to it. We end up in the best cases where 15 people at Blue Meridian are in a very close relationship with each partner over various things. We've been able to help folks with their philanthropy away from Blue Meridian with our network and with our investment ideas. A lot of times things Blue Meridian doesn't pursue are better for some of the individual partners, and they go do that. We've even seen our partners in pairs go off and tackle things away from us as a team, which really feels great. So I think that's the main reason, is that people have a big stake in it from the outset, and we basically require them to stay close to that stake. I know some of our cultivation processes have threatened to break down over the amount of their time that we actually would like to have for our work. And it's a range, and so people can do it as they want. But I heard Scott on a conference call that one of the things he loved about Audacious, where he's been very active, is that it took him 17 minutes to get the download of a great idea, which he and his wife and team could run with. Scott has actually now joined Blue Meridian, and he's got a different deal with us, I assure you. And I think he knows that. He's going to be spending, multiple hours a year with us, with our social sector leaders, because the connection between our funders and the people doing the actual work is something we have to facilitate, or at our own peril if we don't. So it's really, I guess, a mix.
Yeah, and I think, the big things that I'm sort of pulling out that I'm hearing you say, Chuck, that I think are relevant no matter what the organization, that really resonate with me is, get the person sort of deeply engaged, so they're really part of the team. Get them connected to lots of people on the team, right? So they're not just having a relationship with Chuck, they have relationships, you said, most of them with 15 people on the team. And I remember back earlier in my career, I had the good fortune to be involved in soliciting a $50 million gift. And at the time, I was a young CEO in the Boy Scout system. And I was engaged in the process because that person was engaged in the donor was engaged in sort of understanding a future of where they wanted the organization to go. So I spent 3 days driving this person around an event, and I was like, I guess I could drive, who cares? But it was about them building relationships with more and more people in the organization. And that's the kind of cultivation and engagement that I think people are looking for. There's a tendency for CEOs or chief development officers to kind of hold close to their most important donors. But if you really want the person to break through, they really got to have relationships across your organization. So I think that's a super important point. And again, the more they feel on the team, the better. Okay.
Could I jump in with one thought on that? I think one of the most powerful forces at play in our work is peer influence, right? I mean, and increasingly as people look at the list, they say, wow, maybe I could be part of that. But even in the beginning, they were likely to have been approached by someone that they view very much as a peer and who said, I'm doing this, you should check it out. But also coming together as a team to debate investment ideas creates a real intellectual exchange, which we all love when we get into a good one of those, right? So that's an added element that I can't say I've really experienced in quite the same way in most other settings.
Yeah, no, and that's a unique thing I've started to see more organizations do well, is sort of provide an intellectual sort of stimulation as part of their engagement. I was at a board meeting for an organization probably about a year ago, and it really wasn't directly connected to their work, but for the dinner they brought in the state superintendent of schools, and they were an education organization, but and we weren't talking about that program or that board's agenda, but we were talking about education writ large, and that was super engaging for everybody involved. So I think you definitely need to. People are hungrier for that, and the higher you go up the pyramid, the ladder, whatever you want to call it, the more they want that. And it's a unique thing you can give, right? For the, what do you buy the man who has everything, right? Well, the one thing they don't have is the ability to sort of truly sort of cut it up on intellectual things. That's less readily available than, a new pen or a new car. Going to pull some of the questions from our Q&A here. Mindee, what's the sort of thing that sort of in terms of scaling, what keeps you up at night, and how has that changed over the last 2 years? I think I know 2 years ago what was keeping you up at night, but what's keeping you up at night now?
Yeah, I would say for Grameen and for us, it's really building our internal capacity. We've gotten to the place where we're able to attract some of these larger scale gifts and investments, but then our organization needs to be ready to do this work. And so, do we have the right people? Do we have enough of the right people? Do we have the capacity, the training in place to get our folks where they need to be? And so I think for us, it's investing correctly in the capacity, human capacity and organizational capacity to meet the desire of these philanthropists to invest in us and into our cause.
Yeah, I think to sort of power, right? It's from the concern goes from is anyone going to give us any money to oh my God, can we actually spend this money well and sort of keep them happy so they give us more? Yeah.
Right. We have the plan to put it to work, but can we do this well and have the right output to make it work?
Well, they're right. There's a bit of a scary moment of once you get the money, it's well, now can I execute on the, if you start with a big idea and you're a great salesperson, at some point, we have to execute on the idea or what happens. Chuck, is there anything, this is a question here, sort of as this trend of people giving larger gifts, people collaborating as donors in the way that you're seeing, like, is there anything about this trend that concerns you?
Well, I'm sensitive in particular to the increasingly common critique that billionaires should not be deciding the social direction of this country, and that few of them have been willing to take on the systemic issues that may have benefited their wealth creation in order to create social change. And look, personally, I feel like we're engaged. First of all, I acknowledge that. It's a fact of our society. It's one of the big problems we have, and Lord knows, I hope we'll find some ways around it the coming years. However, for me personally, I feel like I'm engaged in a fairly sizable wealth redistribution project that's working reasonably well. And it's actually not, in the end, despite the decision rights and everything else, the individual multi-billionaires who are deciding where the money's going. They're actually relying on a team of us who are very decidedly not multi-billionaires to generate the ideas, put them together in a cogent way, and then manage that process over a long period of time. So I was on a panel with Robert Reich from Stanford, who's been, very vocal and probably appropriately so on this issue. And I felt like I made big progress with him when I explained that we're in these long-term equity-like partnerships with our grantees. It's not hit and run. It's not build them up and then leave them in the lurch. Again, it's complicated and it's not 100% obvious that it's going to work in the long term, but that's how I kind of get my mind around that. But I acknowledge it as a major issue nonetheless.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And sort of similarly, like my defense typically is, I get it, and I'm all about sort of a different system, but in the system we currently operate in, it's like why do you rob banks? That's where the money is, right? Like in the system we currently operate in, I'm going to work with people that have the money and try and put it to the most good that I possibly can. I have a question here. What's your advice for sort of smaller nonprofits trying, Mindee, let's go to you for this one, trying to attract sort of high net worth donors, and then particularly, as a leader of color, I know the person asking the question, finding it much harder to break into certain circles, right? So how do you get access to donors in the first place? And then how do you get over that extra sort of complication of I'm a leader of color?
Right. I think it's important to build the strength of your organization and to make sure that, the organization itself is strong and has the right people and the right programs and has the strategy. And if that means looking for pro bono help for the strategy, but having the pieces in place, I think is what is attractive to funders and to high net worth individuals. And it feels like it only takes, like one or two to get it started. So if you can, whether it's through, again, some of these networks of philanthropy that are putting on these competitions, or through one board member or one contact that can open a door for you, it feels like sort of what Chuck was saying, how people want to then be involved with who else is involved with you. It feels like you need to be patient and understand that, if you can get that first big gift, and understanding what a big gift is for your organization. Maybe it's not an 8-figure gift for your organization, but maybe it's, building towards, that 6-figure gift first and building that base and understanding, what your organization needs and how to, begin to seek out those people, through building in their organizations that could help build your board. And, Robinhood has a program, United Way has a program to help you bring in board leadership that can then bring additional resources or additional context into your organization.
Yeah, I think definitely, my observation, just particularly of your situation, Mindee, is just that, right? It's like the one thing begets the next, and all of a sudden the flywheel takes off, right? Like it seems like you're never going to get there, and then one day, not only do you get there, it just sort of, it's a tipping point, a flywheel, whatever sort of cliche you want to use, but yeah. All right, we're going to sort of round towards the back of this and start wrapping it up. But there's a good question here, Chuck, that I wanted to ask you. And you hear this a lot, and I know you all think in these terms, and you've got some ways you started to address it. But talk about organizations capable of absorbing these larger gifts. And I've seen it, right? I've seen donors say like, I could give you $10 million, but am I going to just drown you? Right? Like what? So how do you think of like an organization being capable of absorbing a big gift?
Well, I want to say first that among our investments, even the biggest ones, great organizations, great leaders, they were nowhere near ready to have this conversation when we first started having it. And how could they be? When have they ever been allowed or allowed themselves to think, what's the biggest thing?
I think Chuck froze, right?
Wonderful creative thing that's good, but we do have specific criteria. We tend to be funding later stage organizations, not exclusively. They tend to have, I'll just say, very strong leadership, a track record of growth with quality, a strong base of evidence, external evidence that the thing they're doing is one of the things that's making a really big difference on the ground. And then the two things that are really hardest to come by, I think, is a platform or channel for scale that's efficient. And that typically is very well aligned with a sustainable economic model over the long term. How many times have we funded wonderful education reform organizations who got really big in Detroit, and then the superintendent is gone or the state takes over the public school system, and really everything they built is out the window. So it's very few organizations meet that criterion, and we're often working with them to help them find it. Actually, what is the platform through which you can scale? We have one organization that can literally over 5 years capture the full market for what they do in a state by making the sale to the state child welfare commissioner. And it's a combination of the impact that their work has on the people they serve and the economic impact it has on the state's budget. And that would be, so if you can do one sale for a whole state instead of, whatever it is, 1,000. Big part of what we do. I will say we're working hard to build the pipeline. So we recognize these are unusual traits. And if we don't help build the pipeline, it'll be to our detriment and our partners' detriment. So we understand that it's hard, and hopefully we'll contribute to more people getting to this place over the coming years as well.
All right, I appreciate it. I think we're going to sort of wrap here. I want to say just sort of one thing. First and foremost, thank you both, Mindee, Chuck. You've got plenty to do in your day. I appreciate you choosing to spend some of it with us. Second, everybody who joined us, same thing, thank you. Trust me, I know how hard it is to be out there as a fundraiser and hear no all day and getting doors slammed in your face. So appreciate you investing some time with us. More importantly, just appreciate what you do because it's amazing. Plug, you're going to get an email with a survey. If you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. Bigger plug, this is part of a series we're doing. We're going to be with Cheryl Dorsey from Echoing Green, and my colleague CJ Orr is going to speak with her on Monday, November 9th. And then a real treat for us on Tuesday, November 17th. We're going to be joined by David Rubenstein, a philanthropist, to sort of get his perspective. So lots more on this topic to go. Please join us. We'd love to see you. Keep doing what you're doing. And thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Greg.
Take care.
Bye-bye.